welcome.
Hi, thanks. That introduction pretty much covers who I am. And, like I have here on the slide, I work for XMission during the day, and I volunteer for Utah Free Media, otherwise known as UtahFM, in the evenings and during all of my other spare time, basically. And before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about what UtahFM is and what it isn't, and give you a little bit of background to help you understand where I'm coming from and the sorts of things that we've managed to do. In terms of background, basically what happened, how many people in the room are familiar with the FM station KRCL? Yep, on 90.9. They've been around just over 25 years. And like a lot of public radio stations around the country, they had a lot of problems trying to maintain listenership, and their listenership kept decreasing and decreasing over time. And they made the decision to adopt a model wherein instead of having a whole lot of daytime volunteers who would operate during the day doing 3-hour slots, they decided that consistency was going to be the best thing, and so they went ahead and fired 25 of their volunteers, some of whom had been there for 20 plus years, and decided instead to hire 3 full-time paid DJs. So the net result of that is that the community was left with about 20 or 25 individuals who had decades and decades of experience in radio, some of whom have gone on to start, other public radio stations, KUER, KCPW. All of those guys have roots in what's been going on at KRCL for 30 years. And to make a long story short, I work for XMission, and I wandered over and said, hey, maybe we can do something about this. Maybe we can put all of these guys online. And from there, essentially after that meeting, I started getting calls the next morning saying, I hear you're the new director of the new KRCL. And that came as quite a surprise to me. And anyway, about 6 weeks after that point, we went from a single idea to a fully functioning online radio station. In this talk, I'm going to basically talk about how we did that and the sorts of tools that we used to get everything into production, the sort of way that we operate, and what you can do if you would like to get interested in radio and start to build your own station using open source tools. So we covered that. In terms of radio, right, we all recognize this guy, being nerds, right, Nikola Tesla, who invented this thing, right, what was essentially the first shortwave radio, and became extremely famous for it. I love that piece of stained glass. Built that, caused that, then caused that, then caused that, but didn't expect that. And what we have there, for anybody who doesn't know, that's Vinton Cerf, who I believe is still with Google. I heard rumors that he was leaving Google, but as far as I know, he's still with Google and is known widely as the father of the internet. 12,500 is the number of online stations, roughly, that we had about 18 months ago. What we have right now is something more like 24,000. So worldwide. Right now we're looking at about 24,000, and we're growing every day. If you want more statistics about that, you can look at something like shoutcast.org, for instance, which is more or less the better resource for ranking stations. Yeah?
Is internet only, or include stations that just also have live?
This is any station that's broadcasting on the net, whether they're both broadcasting terrestrially and online or exclusively online. If you look at weekly internet radio audience just in the last year, and this actually is rather old, you'll see this is 2006, is increased by about 50% to about 30 million. And that's actually, if I go back, those who have listened to internet radio in the last week. Now I'm wondering if we take that into the present room, how many people in this room have listened to internet radio in the past week? That's a lot more than 12%, right? That's easily 65% in this room, if not more like 80%. So you can see that something very important is taking place in terms of media consumption. So how do you build one of these things, right? And how do you make it open source, which is important to me, of course, and important to all of you, and important to our little friend there. So what's so free and open about net radio anyway? Basically, the idea that you can build all of this for very, very little, changing the media landscape really dramatically. In terms of what we did at UtahFM, we ended up in about 6 weeks raising about $10,000, but out of pocket, in order to build the station, we had about $3,000 in audio gear donated to us by Performance Audio, and we have our bandwidth donated to us by XMission, which is my employer. We ended up building the whole station, even if you look at retail prices, for just about $4,000, and that's server gear and everything across the board, all the audio processing gear, everything. And that's retail price, right? If you can get discounts, if you can get used equipment, I'm totally confident that you could build an equivalent station for less than $1,500. So, production. How to go from this, which is the room when we started at the beginning of our 6-week process. This room is in the basement of the Dakota building in downtown Salt Lake City, which is right across from the gateway, to this, which is our finished studio about 6 weeks later. To give you a brief tour of what we have here, and we'll go over all of this in depth, what we have is a radio console here, just like you would see in pretty much any other amateur radio station. This is an Audio Arts console. Linux PC, of course, we'll get into that a little bit later. And a set of 3 CD players there, as well as my personal favorite, a little iPod player that we can use, and we can pre-program. I pre-program my entire show on my iPhone, and I go slap it in and sort of hang out for 3 hours and play music that way, which is a lot of fun. And of course, microphone, mic arm there, what have you. So, in under 3 weeks, right? Which is about as soon as we started building to the point where things were actually going. So, what parts do you need to make this work? And what's the model, right? Yeah? You want to see that one again? All right. The model is really easy, and this isn't going to be a really in-depth technical presentation about how to make one of these, but more to understand generally the sort of components that you're going to need to make an online station, right? Up at the top, you're going to need your audio sources, right? So these are things like microphones, CD players, right? If you're using mini disc, tape, records, what have you, right? You're going to need to get all of this stuff into some sort of mixer, right? A mixer is, any sort of device that you can use to change the properties of all of these inputs, notably probably volume, right? That way you can turn your mic up and then turn the CD player up and what have you. And you want a mixer that you can fade things with, and we'll get into that, right? Which is, when you're listening to radio and you hear, the song playing out, and then you hear like that damn DJ talking on top of it, right? It's because they're fading in over the song, and they're using the mixer to do that. From mixer, we have audio out, and here are really the two unique pieces in terms of online production. As far as what it takes to do streaming, you need 2 pieces. The first is the encoder, and the second is the server. And this model exists pretty much universally for all streaming solutions. We'll talk about in depth what we're using here, but the encoder is essentially responsible for taking that raw audio source and turning it into MP3, OGG Vorbis, AAC, right, FLAC, whatever it is you're going to stream, right? You're going to take raw audio bits, you're going to sample them, right, so on and so forth. And the streaming server The encoder is going to pass that data, right, unicast to the streaming server, one copy. And the streaming server is going to be this really super simple piece of software, and all it does is push bits around, right? So you get the audio source up to the streaming server, and clients, right, being down here at the bottom, are actually going to connect directly to that streaming server and get audio one at a time from that, right? In terms of what you need hardware-wise, you need a little bit more power on the encoder end than you do on the server end, right? You can run this on the smallest possible box you can get your hands on and support 1,000 clients out of the box, no problem, right? There are stations in town that I won't mention that I do work for that build this stuff on like big sun boxes, right? Like, don't, right? Like the Celeron that you can get, right? If you can make it run, let it fly, right? At XMission, we virtualize ours in 128 meg of RAM, and it runs at like 0.01 load, right? All it does is push bits around. Encoder, a little bit more, like, you know, still it's like the lowest end box probably you can get your hands on new these days, like a low, you know, 1.2, you know, gigahertz, like way more than enough, right? For a single stream. If you're going to be doing something like multiple streams, maybe you want to kick it up a bunch. But again, you know, you don't need a bunch of memory in there. It's not doing anything all that complex. It's doing a simple processing task, and it's doing it again and again and again and again. So, you know, don't buy, you know, big processor caches, any of that, right? This is all low-end desktop gear. Don't go nuts, right? So, live audio sources, right? In any major studio, right, or minor studio, amateur studio, you're gonna have a couple of components. You're gonna have mics, mic arms, CD players, right, headphones, consoles, you know, what have you. You know, you don't really, let me go back to that, you don't really want to go nuts again with any of this stuff. And I can talk a little bit about the choices that we made here. Mics, you know, the main thing to keep in mind here is that ultimately you're going to be compressing this down to something like 128K anyway, right? If you go out and buy some, you know, $1,500 studio mic, it's going to sound great right up until the point that it hits the encoder, right? And then it's going to sound just like every other mic, right, you've ever purchased. You know, yeah, it makes things pretty simple. You know, that being said, the super low end is still the super low end, right? Yeah?
But still, a $100 mic is going to be better than a $10 mic.
Right, that's exactly what I'm about to say, is that the low end is still the very low end.
Yeah.
So, you know, you probably want to stay out of the stuff that you would see at CompUSA, but anything that you see at any sort of professional audio store is going to be more than enough, right? More than enough, right? Any sort of reasonable condenser mic is going to do you just fine. Mic arms, right? You're going to want something that you can actually prop this mic up because positioning is extremely important, you'll find, as you're doing this, right? A lot of times people get, you know, these really nice mics and they'll end up sort of, you know, putting the condenser so it's sort of like tilted and screwball, and it'll sound like people are, you know, speaking underwater, or they'll speak out of the back end of the mic, right? They have, for generally studio mics, they have an input direction, so you'll want to, you know, come in from the right side. So you want to make sure that your microphones are positioned right where you want them to be, so that, you know, a person could sort of sit up straight and go directly into it. CD players, here, if you're going to do music, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. First is that you definitely want more than one, right? The second is that you definitely want N+1, because these things are going to break, right? Like, no matter what you get, no matter how much money you spend, right, it's still that same damned, you know, part from, you know, in and out, in and out, in and out, 2 minutes, you know, 12 hours a day, every single day. They're going to wear out. Those trays are going to break. You know, they're going to stop working. So get stuff that you can afford. But if you really are concerned about reliability, you know, don't spend more money on something a lot nicer. Just get whatever you have and get another one, because whatever you have is going to break. We've broken 4 in the past 6 months. And believe me, we've been through everything, and they all break. You know, we use Newmark MP102s, which also play MP3s, which is really nice. That's a feature you might want to look for. When you get into higher end gear, especially in radio production, one thing that you might look for is gear that does remote start, which is a feature such that you can hook the gear to your console, right? So you hook your CD player to your console, and then when you enable that particular track on the console, right, it will send like a 5-volt you know, electrical pulse up to the CD player, and the CD player will know to start, right? Otherwise, you end up hitting play, right? And while you're bringing up the level, which can be kind of a pain. Headphones are extremely important, and a radio console. A lot of people ask me, they take a look at our radio console and they're like, oh my God, how did you get this? How much money did you spend on this? And the answer is actually 0. We didn't spend anything on it. As it turns out, really large corporations really like tax breaks. And radio, as you might be aware, has a couple of really large corporations. And Clear Channel actually gave us 2, right? Like we asked them for 1, and they're like, man, how many can you bring down from Portland, right? And we like filled a car with them and drove them down. They would have given us more had we been able to haul them. They literally like they have so many stations and they're upgrading stuff so often that if you call around, if you look on you know, production mailing list, somebody, right, some engineer has this stuff stashed away. He doesn't want it anymore. They want to get rid of it. So, yeah.
You mentioned about hooking up the iPod.
Mm-hmm.
How come, other than the redundancy, how come you don't just digitize everything and then have it ready for whatever custom playlist you want?
Oh, I'll get to that. You know, so anyway, same idea there. And we'll look at some other options for consoles here as well, because of course we are talking about open source. In terms of audio production, you want to really be careful about processing, right? Especially mic processing, right? You can get, you know, a nice mid-range mic, but if you don't apply any sort of hardware processing to that, or software processing, whatever way you want to go. We went with hardware processing because it's cheap. It's like $100, right? And there you can tune gate and trim and everything else. And you can actually, if you listen to UtahFM, which, you know, I hope you do, and we'll make a pitch, you know, several times for you doing that, you'll be able to hear what I think sounds like a pretty decent voice quality. And you would be so surprised, because if you go way back here in this basement, right, these are big air conditioning ducts, right? And this room right here is considerably quieter than the room that we do our production out of. And if you listen to the stream, unless you're listening really, really carefully, you won't be able to hear it. And that's because of the mic processing that we do. You can pull most of that out, and it will sound great, you know, which sort of belies another point, right? A lot of people get really concerned, you know, oh my God, I have to put, you know, all carpet on the walls and soundproof and yada, yada, yada. 90% of that, especially once you get to the point where it's compressed, you can take that out unless you're just a much bigger perfectionist than I am. You just don't need to worry about that, because processing can take that stuff out. So, mixing, right? One thing that you can do, and this is where we're going to start to get into the open source part of this, there's a really fantastic project out there called the Aurora Mixer that you can take a look at. This is one that somebody has sort of pimped out a little bit. But you can use the Aurora Mixer just like you could a radio console mixer or anything else. And you can see their project online. You can get schematics. They're planning on selling kits, I believe, but they're not to that point yet. And you can use that. You can essentially get the schematics, get the PCB diagrams, send them away to have the circuit boards printed. They'll get them shipped back to you. It's, you know, like 30 or 40 bucks to get a bunch of boards printed. And then go ahead and build one of these yourselves and save a whole lot of money. And it's a super fun project too. So Aurora Pros, they're fairly inexpensive. It's entirely open. It's all USB powered and controlled. You get standard Max MSP and pure data interfaces. If you don't know how that stuff works, I really, even just like as a side hobby project one night, check out Pure Data and Max MSP because it's really cool and there's a great community built around it right now. Cons, it's really time consuming. It's not really a pure hardware solution. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, when they send you the schematics, do you have to use any of the utilities like OCD or anything? Or do they
Well, the schematics are online, and they have like a PCB, right, like a diagram, and you can print it off with like the Eagle PCD sort of diagrammer thing. And there are a bunch of companies, and you just send them that file, and a couple weeks later, right, like back from Germany, here comes your circuit boards, and you go from there. Yeah.
Bash PCB is the best place. I haven't ordered from them, but that is the cheapest place that you can buy.
Right.
And it's like $10 for a setup fee and like $2 for an inch, and that's it. It's really cheap. So.
Right, and these hardware solutions, you need to not be scared of them because there are a whole bunch out there on the net, and you can save so much money by doing open source hardware hacking, especially in a project like this. Other alternatives, you can get reasonably priced mixers by Mackie and others. Use studio mixers like we talked about and old radio console mixers. In terms of goals of what you want to look for there, ideally what you want to have is you want to have a way to preview this stuff, right? So while you want multiple tracks, right, or devices that you can plug into, for each one of those you want multiple channels that you can route output, right? Here's an example of how that might work. You have CD1 up, right, and it's being routed to the live program feed, right? But, oh my God, you burned some CD and you don't remember which track it is you want to play next, right? You can switch CD2 to a preview output, right, and bring that up, listen to it in the studio, decide where you want to be, right, and then when you're ready to go, turn CD2 back to the program feed and turn it up. Does that make sense? Any sort of radio console is going to support this sort of behavior. You can enable that sort of behavior in kind of hackish ways with other consoles, but it's something you really want to keep in mind. Oh, I should mention VU meters are definitely your friend, right, which you don't get on a lot of low-end gear. A lot of times what you hear with net radio stations, especially amateur ones, is you'll hear their levels like going way up and down all over the place. Because no one's watching the VU meter, and you can't really hear it. You think you can, but you can't from a production standpoint, right? It all sounds the same. But when you're watching the meters, you're going to want that to make sure that your listener is getting a consistent experience. And preamps are also your friend, which you're going to, learn the hard way that if you want to connect mics, right? Mics do not come in on line level. You need to bring them up to line level with a device called a preamp. Mics, we talked a little bit about this. Don't go nuts. Go for durability. Chances are very good you're not in an environment suited for high-end mics, so don't do that. A lot of people ask about connecting this stuff to machines, both in and out, right? A big problem that you get with a lot of low-end machines is you get a lot of machine noise, especially when you have audio inputs and outputs that are directly on the motherboard. And so a lot of people stay away from that. But at the same time, you can get around that just by isolating that through USB, right? So basic USB sound cards, just like that, right? That's the iMic by Griffin, right? It's like $50, right? And it works great, right? It takes away all that noise, sounds fantastic. All it has is it has a mic level and it has a line level input. Both are 1/8 inch. And it makes things so much easier, right? And that's fully supported on Linux, by the way. Other studio notes, you want to make sure to split your headphones through a splitter. And the last thing you really want is some sort of audio router that can split and merge these sources, right? Because what you're going to have is at some point you're going to say, well, I want this headphone out, to be output, and I want this to be input. You want sort of device that you can plug all this stuff into and either merge signals together or split them apart or route them in different ways. And a really cheap audio router is going to save your bacon in so many ways, And now an important warning about your financial safety, right? Which is that cables will destroy your life.
Yeah, the question is back to, can't you get mixers that are also routers, or am I?
Yeah, you can. Yeah. Cables can just destroy your whole life, seriously. And I added it up. If we had to pay for cables for our entire setup, it would have been somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,900 just in cabling, right? It's ridiculous. So you need cable making supplies, right? Even if you don't think you can make cables, I never made a single audio cable in my life before I built an entire station, which was a great adventure. But you need about 200 length of audio cable, right? You can go down to Rialco or any cable store, and they'll sell you a big chunk of it, right? It's going to be one pair and shielding. And you need a soldering iron, you're going to get some cable ends and some heat shrink, and lots and lots and lots and lots of free time. It took me 200 hours to do all the cabling for everything. And there's about 400 or 500 feet of cabling in the studio that I built, and it was a lot. But you'll get good at it over time. But don't be afraid of it. What you're going to do probably is generally be working with XLR inputs and outputs. I mean, you remember those, right? They're sort of barrel connectors, and they're super easy to wire up. You just screw them off, you get out your soldering iron and go to town and screw 3 or 4 of them up. After that, you'll be golden, and trust me, it's a skill you are going to want to have. Take care of your cables, and they will take care of you. Don't let anybody touch your cables ever, 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 ever. And after you solder 300 of them, this will come quite naturally to you. So, streaming, right? We talked a little bit about what the model actually is, right, in terms of the encoder and in terms of the streaming. So now we'll sort of get into the open source component of all of this. There are a couple of really good open source options. Before I talk about that, I should point out that right now the streaming community is sort of divided around 2 solutions. There's the Shoutcast solution, right, which right now is controlled by AOL, which is not open source, though it's quite good, and I don't have a lot of bad things to say about it. It's still free, right, and anybody can use it, but it's not GPL'd. Or the GPL'd open source version is Icecast, which I'm a big fan of and work a little bit on the development team, not much. And Icecast is free and open source, and they have developers that hang out and pound Icecast, and you can talk to them, and they're super friendly. So those are sort of your 2 components. Generally, for the most part, I should say, encoders and servers are agnostic in terms of each other, right? Which means, you can generally plug a open source encoder into a closed source server, and that will work out fine. But your mileage may vary. The solution that I like and I use is Icecast on the server end, which is available at icecast.org, and DarkIce on the encoder end. Interestingly, sort of the officially sanctioned version is IceS. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh. Is IceS. I have had bad stability problems with it personally. DarkIce is a little better. I don't get 365-day uptimes with it, but it's better. But the stuff is coming along. It's not the sort of process that you are going to be able to set it and forget it for months or years at a time. It will die at some point. Icecast has a bug where, this is great, I discovered this the other day, where after about 12 weeks of uptime, it will start switching streams, right? So at XMission, we run a bunch of different public radio streams, and people connecting to one stream, like KCBW, were getting KUER, and anyway, not cool.
Any particular preference on the differences between, you want to touch on, between DarkIce, ISIS, and Venus? I've used ISIS. I've seen no need other than you think it's more stable. Is there anything off the top of your head? Is it easier? Is it?
None of them are really all that hard to set up, and I don't have really strong opinions about them. DarkIce is the one I've had the most success with. The one thing that you want to be concerned about is if you're looking at alternative streaming formats, and by alternative I mean other than MP3, you're going to need library support for whatever that format is. So, with DarkIce, for instance, and I can't speak to a lot of these others, but you'll want to make sure that you can, if you're doing FLAC, it's libFLAC or libAAC or whatever. You want to make sure you can get that in because the encoder is going to need to support it. DarkIce is flat file, and we'll actually look at it before I'm done. And again, it's like a stanza. It's not configuring send mail. Trust me, it's fine. Yeah.
Did you look at hardware encoders like BarX or some of the others?
They're way too expensive. Way too much money. I mean, you can get, there is a place for those in the market. You can get so far with this solution. I mean, again, I run most of the public media that's done in Utah, and we run it on a XenSlice 128 meg. And I've pushed nearly 1,000 concurrent users through that, and it doesn't even breathe heavy. So, if you're talking enterprise level 10,000, 100,000, yeah, I'd start to think more carefully about something much bigger. But as something like this, especially where and again, it's part of the role, right? I mean, if UtahFM goes down, like, it'll kind of bum me out, but it's not like I'm not going to get fired, So, and that does happen. So there is a place for those, but personally, I think they're a little overbuilt. You can also look at non-free encoders like Icecast for the Mac, which works really well, has a GUI, super easy. You can send people out into the field with it and say click go and it goes, right? It's very Mac style. So let's look at a DarkIce demo. Hopefully the projector will not die here and will stay up long enough that we can do this. Yes. Okay. So this is a little Debian box that I've set up here. And normally you get Etsy DarkIce. This stuff is super easy. This is like beginner level system administration. It's nothing that you need to be scared of at all. You look at DarkIce, it's your standard config. It has a couple of different stanzas. With DarkIce, sort of the downside is that the stuff is not particularly well documented, but it doesn't really need to be either. So, general, you look at duration. This is if you want to set up a stream that only exists for a certain number of seconds after the process launches. I can't really imagine why you would want to do this, but some people do. Buffer seconds, this is something that you may want to play with over time. For those who aren't familiar with buffering, this is the idea that a client is going to connect and try to get a certain number of seconds of audio prior to the point that it starts playing it. So you may want to adjust this up and down depending on what your situation is and what your clients look like. Reconnect, yes, this is very important because in a lot of situations you'll have encoders and streaming servers that are separated by a large network distance, right? Sometimes across the internet from each other. Which incidentally is what people like StreamGuys.com do, right? They just run the server end, right, and charge you for the bits that you pass in traffic, but you still run the encoder end, right, and you connect across the net to them. So reconnect, yes, is critical. You want your audio device, dev DSP generally. Sample rate, CDs are recorded 44,100 hertz. Right? Because it's stereo, you generally want to drop that to 22050, right? So stereo mono, you want to make sure those correspond. Bits per sample, channel 2, right? Channel is the idea of stereo versus mono here. The only other thing you really want to be concerned with is you set up these Icecast sections here. Bitrate mode, there are two essentially different ways of encoding audio. There is a committed bitrate and a variable bitrate. The idea here in very basic terms is that committed bitrate is going to encode everything, right, at full quality, if you will, right, which is to say that if you have silence, right, it's going to encode everything about that silence and pass it up to the server, right? Whereas variable bitrate is going to try to be a little bit more intelligent and move that bitrate up and down as the audio dictates, right? So if you're playing very complex audio, the bitrate's going to move up and down, and the client is going to see that, right? In this sort of weird attempt, I think it's kind of a weird attempt to save bandwidth. Some clients have a little trouble with VBR. I like the idea. I don't really recommend that you run it unless you just don't. Like, you're just going to run into problems. And bitrate, this is where you're talking about what bitrate you're actually going to stream at, right? So this is, 128 kilobit versus 96 kilobit versus what have you. There are many religious wars about what is the proper bit rate for streaming. 128K is generally considered standard or standard high bit rate. I totally don't want to get into that argument. Generally what I do for clients is I play them a bunch and ask them if they can tell the difference, and as soon as they can, I choose the lowest bit rate and we go from there, right? And oftentimes it's really surprisingly low. Right? Like, generally people can hear 16 to 32. Probably about half the people I talk to can hear 32 to 64. Almost nobody can hear 64 to 128. So again, that's just sort of trial by fire there a little bit. That's pretty much the DarkIce config. You then point it to your Icecast server, give it a port, a password, and you're going to give it a mount point, which is to say that this Icecast server, right, can support many different simultaneous encoders, right? And then people can connect, just like they could connect to a web server at different URLs, right? They can connect to this Icecast server and get different streams. That's the concept of a mount point. That's really all you have there. So DarkIce, super easy, right? There's just about nothing to it. Any questions about that?
Yeah, quickly, the device, I noticed it's set for dev.dsp. Is that the OSS model? How does it handle if you're using something like ALSA, setting for HD?
ALSA works fine, right? I mean, it's just looking for an audio source. It's just calling out to the operating system. So, it depends how your operating system is configured. Any other questions?
Can you stream the same input source at multiple rates?
Yes.
And you just say Icecast?
What you do is Icecast 0, Icecast 1, Icecast 2. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you can, if you have different libraries compiled into DarkIce, you can even do different formats, right? So you could do high and low MP3, right? Like for KRCL, I do high and low MP3, high and low OGG Vorbis, because I'm a big OGG Vorbis fan, right? So on and so forth, for as crazy as you want to get, or until you run out of processor cycles.
So you set that up as maybe like a subdomain now on the same server?
Well, it's the concept of a mount point, right? So like if you go to krcl.org, right, you'll see a link to something like stream.xmission.com/krcl-high, right, which is the section in here corresponding to the high bitrate stream, which is set at 128 kilobit. You'll see another section, Icecast-1, right, that on this krcl.org it corresponds to stream.xmission.com/krcl-low.
That's your mount point?
That's the mount point. That's correct. That's correct. And we'll look at a little bit more in depth when we get to the Icecast side. I mean, the encoding side is super basic, right? Any other questions about this? No? Okay. Back to the presentation. So the server side, right? Icecast and Shoutcast are the two leaders. We mentioned this. Icecast, the developers are super friendly. Like I've talked to them many times. They're really cool. Let's look at an Icecast demo. I didn't plan that very well. Icecast is right now in version 2. From version 1 to version 2, they switched to an XML config. It's a lot nicer. do with Icecast, be careful to run the latest versions because generally Icecast is one of those projects that when they have a bug, they're not kidding, right? Like it's really a bug, which is, and you only see releases from them like once a year. So you want to be on top of those. Okay, this is a little bit more complicated. For those of you who aren't familiar with XML style configs, this looks a little bit intimidating. It's really not bad. The nice thing is that Icecast on the whole is really well documented over at icecast.org, and you'll see a fair amount of documentation for all of these options. And pound Icecast on the net, they're really, really helpful if you drop by. Or if you want to drop by XM Lounge and ask me questions, which is on irc.xmission.com, I'm happy to help you as well. So you're going to have a couple of sections here. And these are all really straightforward. Most of these are limitations, and so they're set up for sensible defaults, but you're going to want to adjust them. Clients, your max number of clients. Sources, the maximum number of encoders that you can support simultaneously. I would recommend you be somewhat. Icecast has very basic HTTP style security, right? If you're more than slightly paranoid, you may want to crank down your sources equivalent to the number of sources you expect, right? Don't like leave it up to 100 and wait for somebody to guess a password, right? That would be bad. Client timeout, header timeout, source timeout, those are generally pretty standard. You don't really want to go mucking about with that too much.
The client count's concurrent, not a cumulative.
That's correct. That's correct. The one thing that you're going to want to change right away is admin user and password. That is for the administrative interface. It has a web interface that you can go into, and you can look at the current number of connected users and what have you. And so you'll want to change that as well as the password for any sources, which we'll look at right down here. You get a port setting. Again, primarily with this config, all you're doing is you're matching it to what you have on the encoder side, right? If you're listening on this side on port 8000, the encoder sends to port 8000, basic stuff, right? There is this concept of relays that is a more advanced topic. It's the idea that you can relay between Icecast servers to either create redundancy or additional capacity. But that's more of an advanced topic that I really want to get into in this particular example. The last place that I want to spend any sort of time is, this is a mount definition, okay? So we talked about the idea of a mount from the encoder perspective. This is the idea of a mount from the Icecast perspective. So again, you're going to match these, right? Username and password, you're going to match that to whatever you have set on the encoder side. Max listeners, right? Dump file, so you can dump this stuff directly to disk if you want to create archives in that way. One very nice feature is intros and fallbacks. Fallbacks is if the encoder goes away, you don't want to start delivering 404s. Instead, you want to deliver a nice audio message that says, oh, sorry, Mike screwed up and UtahFM is offline, ha ha ha, right? And you can do that using a fallback. Here is one thing you're going to want to write down and not forget. Is that you can set up an intro, right? And this is the idea that you can get something like on all our XMission streams, right? Like you connect and you get, hello, this is Pete Ashdown and I am sponsoring the stream and la da 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 da. You have to make sure that that intro is of the same bit rate and the same sample rate as the stream itself, right? Bit rate and sample rate. Because if clients try and jump between bit rates and sample rates in a stream, right, they will freak the hell out, right? So, I mean, iTunes, everything will like drop your stream on the ground and give you all sorts of errors and like completely lose its mind. So make sure that you are not like, oh, I'll play around with intros on my production stream and it will be great. You will break everything. Just make sure that you're testing that and you need the sample rate and the bit rate matched or your life is going to get really, really bad. You can set, authentication, some other advanced options. There are actually quite a number of other advanced options that icecast.org can give you, and you can do all sorts of fancy things. Since this is a beginner presentation, I don't really want to get too much into any of that. Does anyone have questions about the way Icecast is configured in a basic way? Yeah.
Configuration, so I would say that, but it's about Icecast.
Yeah.
Well, is anybody setting up like a public Icecast station so that people that remotely are doing all the encoding and pushing that to that station, and they're trying to fill out their programming to fill out their 24/7, where all the content's coming from very trusted content providers?
I don't know of anybody that's doing that in an open way that sort of has an invitation or a call out for encoders to connect, but I think that would be a great project. Yeah, I don't know of anybody who's doing that right now. Most people are doing it for profit because bits cost a lot of money. So.
How much of the 24,000 online stations are talk shows?
I don't know.
No idea.
I'll tell you this, most of them, or a good number of them, are simulcast, but like terrestrial to online. But an interesting fact, if you look at the top couple, they're not. Like Soma FM, right, are good friends of mine. They are really sort of leading the way right now, and they push. And the interesting thing about net radio, if you get into it right now, I was planning to talk about this a little bit later, is that you can really get in on something that is moving upwards quite quickly, which is to say, for instance, the really top players right now are doing less than what a really small FM station would be doing, right? Like a small FM station might be doing 10,000, 20,000 concurrent listeners, right, in a medium-sized to small market, where Soma FM, which is on the top of the streaming pile, does about the same, right? And this is changing really, really rapidly. But it's interesting to see that as we move more and more toward net radio, we'll talk about this in a minute, that those numbers, those raw numbers, are only going to increase and increase really, really dramatically.
Does Icecast allow you to switch between the live and pre-recorded stuff?
That
on the server, and so you just switch through. And then the next follow-up question is anybody tempted to also on the pre-recorded stuff to have the RSS feed?
Right. The answer to that is that people are experimenting with switching in the Icecast world. It's definitely not supported, and it's definitely not something I would recommend you try and do. I know it's being done out there in the world, but my personal feeling is that it's a little hackish right now. The way I do it, actually, because at the station we're live 12 hours a day, and then we switch to archived content at night. And the way I do it is at the station, the night DJ, when they finish their shift at 9 p.m., they actually go to a machine in the studio, bring up an audio source there, they feed it through the encoder. From the encoder perspective, it's just another live source. That's a better way to do it, I think. Are there other questions? No? Okay, I'm going to be sort of quick here because I'm about out of time. Okay. Okay, we are just about done now. Oh, help if I actually went to, we'll blow through this. Storing content, keep everything if you can. At 12 hours a day, we only do about 30 gig a month of storage, which really isn't that much. And you're going to want that content at some point, so just store it, burn it off to DVDs. Managing content, this is another place where open source actually shines pretty well. We use Amarok right on the PC. All our DJs run an Ubuntu desktop right there in the studio, which is great, free, yada, yada, yada. With Amarok, the one thing you want to keep in mind is that as soon as you start getting up into the hundreds of gigs of music, you're going to want to switch from something like SQLite, which is what Amarok ships with, to a MySQL backend, which works really, really well. There's documentation on the Amarok wiki about how to do this. Going mobile, all right? Mobile to clients right now requires a little bit of hackery. And this is like mobile to iPhones, right? I do it on UtahFM. A couple other people are doing it right now. Soma's doing it. WFMU is doing it. Not a lot of other people are doing it. And the problem boils down to the way that some clients, namely like the iPhone and some Flash clients, expect content length, because this is all delivered over HTTP. They expect an absurdly long content length. And most, or rather, the streaming servers that are out right now don't support this. I, however, have a copy of Icecast that does support this, which I am happy to share with anybody who is interested. Mobile production, we use the EEPC. Oh, well, I screwed those slides up. Anyway, that's ways to get around the mobile production problem. Shoutcast is going to be coming out with a fix. It's in beta right now. It'll probably be out like any day/hour now. Icecast has actually told me they aren't interested in it. They know what the problem is. Don't ask me. It's one of those open source, pissing matches. Post-production, for options, you don't have a lot. I would love to be in love with Audacity. I'm really not in terms of like sophisticated multi-track editing. It's the best you have in the open source world now, but in terms of doing really sophisticated production, I hope it gets better, and that's really all I can say about it.
I've had some complaints there, but I'm curious as far as any type of post, why you want to stay away from Audacity.
I have stability problems. I would like it to be a little bit more sophisticated in terms of what I can do. Normalization, I think, is really bad. I've had a lot of problems trying to fade in and out. I've had really bad hardware support problems, right? Both on Linux, and I can get Linux to recognize sources, and then Audacity's like, oh my God, more than one source, and it loses its mind. Those are the problems I've had thus far, and I got frustrated pretty quickly with it, to tell you the truth. Right now, I'm using Audacity, but it's not where I want it to be, and it's problematic. Licensing, and so I have like 2 minutes, right? And I'll finish these questions because this is generally what most people are concerned about. Licensing is really and truly not as bad as you think, right? Like everyone on the net is really freaked out, like we're going to destroy net radio. These problems are real, but if you are a small webcaster and you're doing music, and especially if you're nonprofit, you can do this and you can afford it. UtahFM's bills. There are 3 groups, ASCAP, well 4, BMI, CSAC, which is Canadian, and Sound Exchange. Generally licensing in a nutshell, it's based on some calculation of percentage of revenue plus listener hours, which means you have to track all of that. The reporting formats are non-trivial, meaning you probably have to write Perl to get them done right. It's really bad. But for instance, if we just paid BMI, it was $150. Right, for a quarter, yeah. So, and that's about 30,000 songs. So it's not bad. If you're a big provider, if you're Soma, if you're one of these guys, absolutely, they're getting killed. I'm not trying to trivialize their issue. If you're a small webcaster, you can probably do it. You can probably afford it. And bear in mind that they are actually tracking your they're asking you to report your income. If you have 0 income, that's going to reduce your fees to them even more. So it's something to keep in mind. There's some radio automation options. I think I'm basically out of time, so I'm going to skip that. The bat phone. We made a phone out of a fire alarm to alert people, and I have some schematics of how to do that. I think we're basically pretty much out of time, so I'm going to skip the rest of that stuff. If anyone wants to ask me questions about that, feel free. But other than that, thank you very much.